transition was not one of fire and brimstone, but of jarring, offensive peace. One moment, the Doomslayer stood upon the crimson soil of a world sundered by demonic corruption, the shrieks of the damned echoing in his ears. The next, he was somewhere else. The air, thick with the stench of sulfur and ozone, was replaced by the cloying scent of damp earth, pine, and something faintly sweet, like pollen. Silence pressed in, a heavy blanket where a symphony of violence had been. For a being whose entire existence was defined by relentless, holy war, the quiet was the most disorienting weapon of all. He stood motionless, a 2-meter titan of jade-green armor amidst towering, emerald-leafed trees that scraped a sky marred by a shattered moon. His helmet's polarized visor reflected this broken world, and the internal HUD flickering erratically as it struggled to reconcile the environmental data. Atmospheric composition, breathable. Radiation levels, negligible. Demonic presence, 0. It was this last reading that caused the smallest, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. 0. The universe, in his long and brutal experience, was never at 0. This was a place of vibrant, aggressive life. Strange birds with multicolored plumage flitted through the canopy, their calls like discordant bells. The ground was a carpet of lush moss and tangled roots, a stark contrast to the scorched metal and gore-slicked rock that was his natural habitat. He was an engine of extermination in a garden that had no knowledge of his godless creed. This world felt wrong, too soft, too bright, its shadows holding not malevolence, but simple darkness. Yet, as his boots crunched softly on a fallen branch, he knew that peace was always a lie, a prelude to the inevitable scream. He was a weapon, and weapons are not granted retirement. They are merely pointed at a new target. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. For in the end, there is only one truth. Rip and tear. His Praetor Suit, scarred with the millennia of 1,000 battles, hummed with a low thrum of contained power. Argent energy cycled through its arcane conduits, a sliver of hell's own power turned back upon itself. He began to move, each step a deliberate, ground-shaking tread that spoke of irresistible momentum. There was no grace to his movement, and only the brutal economy of a predator. His gaze swept the forest, the helmet's threat scanner searching for a signature, a sign of the enemy. It found one. Not demonic. The readings were clear on that. There was no soul, no spark of malevolent intelligence that he was attuned to. It was a blank spot, a void in the shape of a wolf. A pack of them emerged from the dense undergrowth. They were creatures of nightmare, pitch-black fur absorbing the dappled sunlight, their bodies adorned with jagged, bone-white plates. Red eyes, devoid of any emotion save a primal hunger, fixed on him. They were beowulfs, the common Grimm of Remnant, and they knew only one truth: that which lived must be extinguished. They stalked forward, low growls rumbling in their chests. They sensed no aura, no shimmering shield of a soul to feast upon, and they sensed no fear. They sensed nothing. This green giant was a hole in the world, an impossible statue of rage, and their simple, violent programming compelled them to destroy the anomaly. The first Beowulf lunged, claws extended. It was a mistake it would not have time to regret. The Slayer's left arm shot out, a piston of green armor, and caught the beast by its throat. There was no struggle. There was only the sound of compressed air, a wet crunch of bone, and the Grimm's head was torn from its shoulders. It did not bleed. Its body began to disintegrate into black smoke even as the Slayer tossed the head aside. 2 more leaped at him from the flanks. He didn't turn. The super shotgun was in his hands, its double barrels a declaration of intimate violence. The roar of the weapon was a sound of cataclysmic finality, a sound this forest had never known. The blast, a storm of incandescent buckshot, vaporized the torso of one Grimm and sent the other tumbling back in a cloud of dissolving black particles. He moved forward into the pack. A beowulf swiped at his head. He ducked under the blow, his right arm ramming forward. The Doomblade, a spring-loaded bayonet of superheated argent steel, erupted from his gauntlet and punched clean through the Grimm's chest. He lifted the creature, its legs kicking feebly, and ripped the blade upwards, splitting it in two before it could fully dissipate. He was a whirlwind of calculated fury. He crushed a skull under his boot. He grabbed another by the jaw and tore it apart with his bare hands. It wasn't a fight. It was a process. Demolition. Extermination. Unseen by the slayer, 4 figures watched from a ridge, their faces a mask of shock and terror. Team CRDL, tasked with clearing this sector of Grimm for their beacon combat exercise, had been moments from being overwhelmed by an Ursa Major and the pack of Beowulfs. Now, their would-be executioners were being systematically dismantled by something they couldn't comprehend. It wasn't a huntsman. Huntsmen were elegant, their movements a dance of aura-fueled acrobatics and dazzling semblances. This was different. This was butchery. The Ursa Major, a bear-like Grimm the size of a small bull, finally charged, a roar of mindless anger shaking the trees. It swung a paw studded with bone spikes capable of shredding steel. The Slayer met the charge, head-on. He didn't dodge. He planted his feet, lowered his shoulder, and punched the charging Grimm in the face. The sound was like a thunderclap. Bone shattered. The Ursa staggered back, its head misshapen, dazed. The Slayer seized the opportunity. He lunged, grabbing the beast's massive arm, planted a boot on its chest for leverage, and pulled. Muscle, sinew, and bone tore with a sickening wet rip, and the Ursa's arm came free from its socket. Before the Grimm could even register the catastrophic injury, the Slayer swung the severed limb like a club, smashing it against the creature's own head and caving in its skull. The Ursa fell, its colossal body already turning to black smoke. The Slayer stood for a moment in the sudden quiet, the last wisps of dissolving Grimm fading into the air. He lowered the bloody arm, then let it drop. It too disintegrated. He noted that. No bodies, no viscera, no resources to harvest, just dust. His helmet slowly turned, to sweeping past the petrified students of Team CRDL. There was no acknowledgement in the gesture. His sensors registered them as living, non-hostile, and therefore irrelevant. His mission was singular. He turned away from them and continued his inexorable march deeper into the woods, the super shotgun resting on his shoulder. The forest was quiet once more, but its peace was now truly, profoundly broken. The office at the top of Beacon Tower was a place of quiet contemplation, its clockwork mechanisms ticking with a rhythmic certainty that the world outside so often lacked. But today, the rhythmic sound was a counterpoint to the chaos unfolding on the polished obsidian surface of Headmaster Ozpin's desk. A holographic projection, transmitted from the scroll of Cardin Winchester, played on a silent loop. The footage was shaky, captured from a distance by a terrified student, but its contents were horrifyingly clear. The green behemoth moved through the Grimm like a reaper through wheat, each motion an exercise in brutal finality. There was no wasted energy, no flourish, only the physics of violence applied with absolute expertise. The 3 most powerful figures in the kingdom of Vale watched, their expressions a mixture of awe, concern, and profound disbelief. General James Ironwood, his white-gloved hands clasped tightly behind his back, leaned forward, his metallic torso reflecting the grim light of the hologram. His eyes, cold and analytical, missed nothing, The impossible strength required to tear an Ursa's arm from its socket. The strange, flickering blade that emerged from the gauntlet, the concussive force of the double-barreled shotgun. He saw not a monster, but a solution. Incredible. Ironwood's voice was a low rumble, breaking the silence. The efficiency is perfect. No hesitation, no wasted motion. Every action is dedicated to the complete and total annihilation of the target. He straightened up, a severe look on his face. This is the ultimate Grimm-killing weapon. Glinda Goodwitch, standing beside him with her arms crossed, looked aghast. Her lips were a thin, tight line. A weapon, James? Look at it. That is not the work of a huntsman. It's savagery. He doesn't fight, he butchers. There is no honor, no artistry. Huntsmen are the protectors of humanity, the shield against the darkness. That thing is just a different kind of darkness. It's effective, Ironwood countered, his tone sharp. While your honorable huntsmen are performing acrobatics, this entity eliminated a threat that had a full team of students on the verge of failure in under a minute. We need that kind of effectiveness. We need that power on our side. Ozpin remained seated, his hands steepled before him, his gaze fixed on the looping image of the Slayer crushing a Beowulf's skull. He took a slow sip from his mug, the silence stretching as he considered their words. He had seen millennia of war, nor of heroes and monsters, but this was something new. He finally set the mug down, the small clink of ceramic on glass echoing in the room. You are both correct, he said, his voice calm and measured, yet heavy with an unspoken weight, and you are both missing the most important, the most terrifying detail. He gestured a hand toward the hologram, and the image froze on a close-up of the Slayer's impassive helmet. James, your sensors in the area. Glinda, your own observations. What is the one thing that every living creature in this world possesses, the one thing that defines our very existence, that this being lacks? The realization dawned on them. Ironwood's usual confidence faltered for a fraction of a second. It's aura, he stated, the words feeling foreign and impossible. There's no reading, none at all. We thought it was a sensor malfunction. It is no malfunction, Ozpin confirmed, his eyes grave. Aura is the light of the soul, the manifestation of our being. The Grimm are terrifying because they are soulless creatures of destruction. They are the antithesis of humanity. Yet they are simple, driven by a primal instinct to extinguish the soul. This being shows intelligence, it uses technology, it makes tactical decisions, but it has no soul we can detect. It is an anomaly, a paradox that should not exist. The implications of Ozpin's words settled over the room, colder than the air outside the tower. A creature with the power to challenge a maiden, yet with the spiritual signature of an inanimate object. Glinda's mind raced. An android, then, one of Atlas's prototypes. Ironwood shook his head immediately. No, not one of ours. We don't have anything that's sophisticated, that powerful. The energy signature from its suit and weaponry is alien. It doesn't match any known dust reaction. My R&D department would kill for a chance to study it. His focus was already shifting back to the practical, the tangible. Control. Acquisition. And what if you cannot control it? Ozpin posed the question gently, yet it carried the force of an accusation. What if you are attempting to put a leash on a hurricane? This creature, this Slayer, operates with a certainty that borders on the absolute. He has a purpose. We do not know what that purpose is, but we know he will pursue it relentlessly. We have no way to reason with it, no soul to appeal to. It is a force of nature in the shape of a man. Ironwood's jaw tightened, the muscles in his cheek flexing. Then we point it in the right direction. We give it a target, the Grimm, Salem. The name hung in the air, a forbidden word spoken only in the most trusted of circles. Ozpin sighed, a deep, weary sound. He stood and walked to the vast window overlooking his academy, the students below like tiny, fragile ants. He is not one of her creations. The Grimm fear him, not in the way they fear a huntsman's skill, but in a more fundamental way. They sense a predator far more dangerous than themselves. She will see this. She will wonder, as I do, what happens when an unstoppable force arrives on a world with an immovable object. It disrupts the balance, James. My entire life has been about maintaining that balance, playing a chess game across generations. This is not a chess piece. This is someone kicking over the entire board. Then we pick up the pieces and use the one that's left standing, Ironwood declared, his mind made up. His patience for philosophy had reached its limit. My men have a lock on its position. It's moving towards the abandoned temples in the east. I'm sending a team to make contact. To make contact or to contain? Glinda challenged, her tone icy. To secure a strategic asset, Ironwood replied without flinching. I'm not leaving a weapon of that magnitude wandering around unsupervised in your kingdom, Ozpin. It's too dangerous. Ozpin didn't turn from the window. He could already see the bullheads taking off from Ironwood's flagship. He could see the futures branching, the carefully laid plans of 1,000 years fraying at the edges. The game had changed, and a new player had entered the field, one who did not know the rules, and whose only strategy was to rip and tear until nothing else was left. Be careful, James, he murmured, more to himself than to the general. You may find that the leash you are attempting to forge is, in fact, a trigger. The VTOL descended through the misty air of the forever fall forest, its engines whining as it settled in a clearing of red-leafed trees. The abandoned temple complex was a skeletal ruin nearby, stone pillars choked with vines and ancient archways gaping like mouths into the darkness. For the Ace operatives, this was just another mission. They were the best of the best, the scalpel of the Atlesian military, and their confidence was a palpable force. They moved as one, disembarking from the craft with a discipline that bordered on inhuman. Each wore the signature white and grey of Atlas, but their individual personalities shone through in their gear and their gait. Clover Eby, their leader, adjusted his collar, his easygoing smile a stark contrast to the tension of their objective. His semblance, good fortune, and was a subtle but powerful tide that bent probability in his favor. "All right, Aesops," he said, his voice crisp and clear over their comms. "Command wants this asset contained, not neutralized. He's to be considered extremely dangerous, but he's not our enemy. We make contact, we establish dialogue, and we escort him back to Atlas for debriefing. Simple as that." Harriet Bree stretched her legs, a blur of motion even when standing still. "Simple. Clover, did you see the footage? That thing tore an Ursa apart with its bare hands. There's no talking to that." "There's always a way to talk," Vine-Zaki countered, his voice a serene monotone. His lithe frame was coiled with a deceptive strength, his aura-forged limbs ready to extend and restrain. "And if talking doesn't work?" Elmedarn cracked her knuckles, and the sound like rocks grinding together. The heavy hitter of the team, she was itching for a chance to test her strength against this newcomer. "Then Marrow freezes him in place and we wrap him up," Clover finished, clapping Marrow on the shoulder. The Faunus operative nervously adjusted his braces. His semblance stay was their ultimate lockdown tool. "Right. Stay. Because that's going to work on that," Marrow muttered, unconvinced. They entered the ruins, spreading into a perfect search formation. The place was an eerie boneyard of Grimm. Dissipating clouds of black smoke hung in the air, and the ground was littered with fractured bone plates and grim masks that had not yet faded. The target was close. The sheer scale of the slaughter was unnerving, even for them. They found him in the central courtyard, but was standing before a crumbling altar. A pack of King Taigetus, massive two-headed serpents, had nested there. Now their severed heads and dissolving bodies were strewn across the flagstones. The slayer stood over the last one, his boot on its twitching neck, and slowly, deliberately, crushed its skull. He didn't seem to notice their arrival. Target acquired, Clover stated calmly into his comms. Initiating contact. Everyone be ready. He strode forward, projecting an air of non-threatening authority. Greetings. My name is Clover Eby, leader of the Ace Operatives. We're with the Atlesian military. We'd like to have a word with you. The slayer did not turn. He simply retrieved a massive serrated chainsaw from its magnetic holster on his back. With a deafening roar, he activated it and began systematically sawing the dead Grimm's corpse into pieces, the act one of sheer, contemptuous desecration. The message was clear. You are not important enough to acknowledge. Clover's smile tightened. All right, plan B. Marrow, now. Stay, Marrow yelled, pointing a hand at the green figure. A wave of blue energy washed over the slayer, the command to freeze echoing in the very air. For a single, fleeting heartbeat, the slayer paused, the chainsaw whining. The Aesops began to move in, then with a grunt that was more vibration than sound, the slayer took a step. The blue energy of Marrow's semblance shattered around him like glass. He was not held, he was not stopped, he simply refused. Marrow's eyes went wide with panic. It didn't work, he just walked through it. Harriet was already a blur. My turn. She zipped past, her speed semblance kicking up a cloud of dust, attempting to disarm him. She was a lightning bolt, too fast to track, but the slayer didn't try to track her. As she circled back for another pass, his super shotgun was already aimed at where she was going to be. He fired. Harriet shrieked as the blast wave caught her, not hitting her directly, but sending her tumbling end over end, her aura flickering wildly as she crashed into a pillar. Harriet! Elm roared, activating her own semblance. Wooden roots erupted from the ground, thick as pythons, and snaked around the slayer's limbs, seeking to anchor him. He was momentarily bound, the wood groaning under the strain. He revved the chainsaw and simply sawed through the roots holding his right arm, then brought the plasma rifle up. And a stream of incandescent blue energy incinerated the remaining roots, the superheated gas causing the air to shimmer. Vine sent his aura tendrils out, trying to ensnare the slayer's weapons, but the green warrior was a maelstrom of motion, batting them away with contemptuous ease. This was not a fight. This was an attempt to stop a natural disaster. Clover's luck held. A volley of plasma that should have hit him squarely went wide, striking a crumbling statue and causing it to topple. He dodged the falling debris, using the opening to hook his fishing rod weapon, Kingfisher, around the slayer's leg. He pulled, expecting to unbalance him. The slayer didn't move. He was an anchor, a mountain. He simply reached down, grabbed the line, and yanked. Clover was pulled off his feet and sent flying towards him. The slayer discarded the chainsaw, his gauntlet blade snapping out. He wasn't aiming to kill, he was aiming to end this. He caught Clover mid-air, not with the blade, but with a crushing grip. He slammed the Aesop's leader into the ground, the impact cracking the stone beneath him and shattering the last of his aura. The slayer stood over him, raising a heavy boot. Enough! Ironwood's voice boomed from the heavens, broadcast from the VTOL hovering overhead. Stand down! That is an order! Disengage! The slayer paused, his boot hovering over Clover's head, his helmet tilted up, his impassive visor staring into the gunship's cockpit. There was no defiance, no acknowledgement. He simply registered the new variable. He had assessed these four warriors. They were skilled, powerful, but ultimately they were fragile. They were not demons. They were not the enemy. They were merely an obstacle, and the obstacle had now been removed. He lowered his foot, turned his back on the broken, bruised, and utterly defeated elite team, and walked away into the shadows of the ruined temple, his heavy treads echoing the finality of their failure. Aboard the ship, General Ironwood stared at the tactical display, his face ashen. He had not found a weapon. He had found a god of war, and he had just pointed all his guns at it. The land of darkness was a monument to a dead god's spite. Jagged purple crystals clawed at a perpetually twilight sky, and the very air was thick with a miasma of ancient despair. Here, in the heart of a continent petrified by divine wrath, lay the domain of Salem. Her throne room was a cavern of obsidian and bone, looking out over bubbling, viscous pools of black ooze, the birthing pits of the Grimm. From this nexus of annihilation, she could feel the pulse of the world. Remnant was a tapestry woven from the threads of life, and every thread resonated with the soul's energy. She could feel the bright, defiant sparks of hope and courage, the delicious, lingering echoes of fear and sorrow, and the steady, thrumming hum of mundane existence. These emotions were the currents in which her Grimm swam, the sustenance for their endless hunger. So for millennia, she had watched this tapestry, learned its patterns, and expertly plucked its threads to unravel the works of her former love, Ozma. Today, however, a thread was missing. It was more than missing. It was a hole, a burn mark, a patch of absolute nothingness that had suddenly appeared in the grand design. It was a silent void amidst the symphony of souls. Her attention, usually fixed on the political machinations in Atlas or the location of the Fall Maiden, was now drawn to this anomaly. It felt like a patch of vacuum in a hurricane, a spot of cold in a furnace. It was centered in the kingdom of Vale, moving with a steady, relentless purpose. It was not the bright, blinding light of a silver-eyed warrior. That was a pain she knew, a familiar and infuriating sting. It was not the warm, steady glow of a maiden's power. It was nothing. A soulless void that moved and thought and acted. Her connection to her children, the Grimm, was absolute. Through their eyes, she saw. Through their instincts, she felt. When a pack of beowulfs had first cornered the anomaly in the Emerald Forest, she had felt a flicker of something new through them. It was not the familiar terror of a huntsman's blade or the defiance of a cornered soul. It was a primal, instinctual command to flee. It was the feeling of prey staring into the eyes of a predator, so far beyond its comprehension that its very existence was an affront to nature. Then, one by one, their connections to her were severed. Not faded, but extinguished with a jarring finality, like candles snuffed out in a void. Now, in the ruins of the Forever Fall, she felt it again. As she had guided a nest of King Tygetus to the temple, hoping their strength would test this new variable. Through them, she experienced the confrontation. She felt the ground shake with its footsteps. She felt the air tear with the roar of its strange, dustless weapons. But most importantly, she felt their own soulless nature recoil. The Grimm were drawn to the negative emotions of humanity, fear, anger, sadness. This thing projected none of those. It projected a clean, sterile, absolute rage that was not an emotion to be fed upon, but an acid that dissolved their very being. It was a force of pure negation. A low growl rumbled from the shadows of the throne room, and Cinderfall knelt before her queen. She had been reporting on her progress with the Vytal Festival infiltration, but Salem had fallen silent. Her pale, a crimson-veined face turned towards the scrying pool at her feet. "My queen?" Cinder asked, her voice a mixture of deference and curiosity. "Is something amiss?" Salem's gaze, ancient and terrible, slowly lifted from the pool. "There is a new player on the board, Cinder. One not of Ozma's choosing, nor of mine. Her voice was a soft, sibilant whisper that seemed to slither through the air. It is a man, encased in green armor. Ironwood tried to capture him. He failed. Spectacularly. A flicker of surprise crossed Cinder's features. For the vaunted ace operatives to fail was significant. An agent of Ozpin's. A new weapon. No, Salem said, a thoughtful, almost academic curiosity in her tone. This is not a weapon forged by man. It is something else. My children do not hunger for it. They fear it. They look upon it and know, in the very fabric of their being, that they are looking at their own extinction. She rose from her throne, a spectral figure of white and black, and glided towards the balcony overlooking the Grimm pits. For eons, the only true threat to my Grimm was the light of the soul. Huntsmen, maidens, the silver eyes, all powered by hope, by spirit. This thing is different. It fights with a fury that rivals any Grimm, yet has no soul to plunder. It is a walking contradiction, a soulless creature of pure, destructive will. She could feel it now, a cold spot of absolute certainty walking through her world, a world she had come to see as her own personal purgatory. It was an exterminator entering a pest-infested house, and she and everything she had created were the pests. It was not a hero coming to save the world, but it was a cleaner coming to sterilize it. For the first time in centuries, Salem felt a sliver of something that was not boredom or hatred or melancholy. It was a profound, chilling intrigue. This was not part of the game. This was a force that threatened to shatter the very rules by which the game was played. It must be understood, Salem whispered, more to herself than to Cinder. Its nature must be laid bare. Her crimson eyes narrowed, a predatory gleam within them. She had the perfect tool for such a task, one who understood rage, violence, and worship in equal measure. "Find Tyrion," she commanded, her voice regaining its cold authority. "Tell him a new Messiah walks upon Remnant, and I wish for him to test its faith." The silence that followed the retreat of the Atlesian airship was not peace. It was a tactical lull. The Doomslayer stood amidst the ruins of the Forever Fall Temple, the cooling barrels of his weaponry ticking in the mountain air. For the first time in an eternity of conflict, the Slayer felt a phantom sensation he hadn't experienced since the early days of the Martian invasion. The weight of finite resources. His internal HUD, a complex tapestry of amber and crimson data streams, flickered with a persistent, low-priority warning. Argent reserves, 14%. Ammunition capacity, 22%. Power-to-mass ratio, suboptimal. In the hellscapes he usually frequented, this was never an issue. The ecology of hell was a closed loop of suffering and energy. And every demon he tore asunder released a burst of argent energy that the Praetor Suit absorbed through its siphoning vents, mending armor and replenishing his strength. To kill was to survive. To slaughter was to thrive. But Remnant was different. The creatures he had decimated, the Beowulfs, the King-Tide Getus, the Ursa, were not biological entities in the traditional sense, nor were they demonic. They were manifestations of a primal, soulless malice. When they died, they did not leave behind viscera, blood, or the boiling heat of a corrupted soul. They simply ceased. They turned into a fine black particulate that drifted away on the wind, leaving no trace of their existence. For the Slayer, this was more than a curiosity. It was a logistical crisis. He was a furnace that required constant stoking, and he was currently operating in a world that offered no wood. He began to move, leaving the ruins behind. His destination was unguided, dictated only by the topographical maps his suit was slowly assembling from long-range scans. He needed a source of power. He needed an equivalent to the boiling pits of Argent. He passed through a grove of trees where the leaves were a vibrant, bleeding red, his heavy boots crushing the fallen foliage. The scent of ozone and pine filled his helmet, a jarring contrast to the sulphurous stench of the void. As he walked, his sensors detected a faint, crystalline resonance coming from a valley several miles to the east. It wasn't the jagged, chaotic frequency of hell energy, but it was potent. It was organized. His progress was interrupted by a shadow that blotted out the sun. A nevermore. A massive bird like Grimm with a wingspan that rivaled a small aircraft circled above. It shrieked, a sound like grinding metal, and banked for a strafing run. Large, bone-like feathers, sharp as obsidian shards, rained down upon the Slayer's position. He rolled to the side, the heavy shards thudding into the earth where he had stood moments before. He brought the plasma rifle up, his finger tightening on the trigger, but he hesitated. The weapon was a gas-operated energy burner. Every shot consumed a fraction of his remaining cells. He lowered the rifle and reached for his back. The heavy cannon was loaded with micro-missiles, but that, too, was a dwindling resource. He stood his ground as the Nevermore dove, its massive beak agape. At the last possible second, he leaped. His thrusters fired, a violent burst of blue flame that propelled him 20 feet into the air. He landed on the creature's back, his boots magnetizing to its bone-plated spine. The Nevermore shrieked in outrage, twisting and rolling to dislodge the passenger. The Slayer didn't use a gun. He slammed his fist into the creature's neck, the armored knuckles cracking the bone-white mask. He grabbed the edge of a wing and pulled. The sound of tearing muscle was muffled by the bird's screams. With a brutal heave, he ripped a massive chunk of the wing joint free. The Nevermore plummeted, crashing through the canopy and slamming into a rocky outcrop. As it struggled to rise, its body already beginning to smoke and dissolve, the Slayer didn't look for health packs or ammo crates. He watched the black smoke drift away, his HUD remaining stubbornly in the red. So he had used 2% of his suit's kinetic capacitors for that jump, and he had gained nothing in return. This world was a desert of energy, and he was a man dying of thirst. He continued toward the source of the resonance, his pace quickening. The valley opened up to reveal a small, fortified mining outpost. It bore the logo of the Schnee Dust Company, a snowflake-like emblem that spoke of corporate dominance and refined resources. The outpost was under siege. A swarm of smaller Grimm, creeps and lancers were battering against the perimeter fences, while a handful of terrified security guards fired their dust-loaded rifles with frantic, disorganized desperation. The Slayer didn't care about the politics of the mine or the lives of the gods. He cared about the crates stacked in the open loading bay, and they were filled with raw and refined dust, elemental energy trapped in crystalline form. His suit's sensors flared. The energy density was high, though the frequency was unstable. It was highly volatile, prone to explosive reactions if mishandled. To a scientist, it was a delicate resource. To the Slayer, it was fuel. He entered the fray like a thunderbolt. He didn't use his guns. He couldn't afford to. He used the environment. He grabbed a heavy steel beam from a construction rack and swung it in a wide arc, pulverizing a dozen creeps in a single blow. He caught a lancer mid-flight, its stinger inches from a guard's throat, and crushed it against the side of a transport truck. The guards watched in stunned silence as the Green Titan cleared the perimeter in less than 2 minutes, a whirlwind of silent, efficient brutality. Once the immediate threat was neutralized, the Slayer ignored the guard's stammered thanks and strode directly to the loading bay. He tore the lid off a crate labeled Hard Light/Gravity Refined. Inside were shimmering violet crystals. He reached out with his gauntlet, his suit's siphoning ports opening. He didn't know if it would work. Dust was an atmospheric resource, a product of Remnant's unique ecology. Argent was the soul stuff of the damned. As his hand closed around a large crystal, the Praetor Suit system screamed. A violent surge of violet energy traveled up his arm. His HUD turned a blinding white, then reset. The armor's power levels began to climb. Slowly at first, then with a frantic velocity. 15%, 30%, 60%. The suit's internal AI, a cold analytical presence, began remapping the energy conduits. Said it was stripping the elemental properties of the dust, converting the raw potential into a universal kinetic charge. It wasn't as efficient as Argent. The burn rate was higher, and the strain on the capacitors was significant. But it was power. He looked at his hands. The gauntlets now hummed with a faint violet shimmer. He reached for his super shotgun and broke the action. He took a handful of fire dust shards from a nearby bin and jammed them into the shell casings. It was a crude, dangerous modification that would have killed a normal man. When he snapped the weapon shut, the barrels glowed a dull, angry orange. The Slayer looked out across the valley. More Grimm were coming, drawn by the slaughter and the sudden flare of energy. He didn't feel the weight of his armor anymore. He didn't feel the drain of his weapons. Yet he felt the familiar, cold hum of readiness. He had adapted. He had found his fuel. Remnant thought it was a world of scarcity, a world where the Grimm eventually wore everything down. They were wrong. He would turn their world's own heart into a weapon against them. He would burn their darkness with the very light they sought to extinguish, and he would not stop until the fire consumed them all. The ruins of Mountain Glen were a tomb of gray concrete and shattered dreams, a subterranean expansion of veil that had been swallowed by the Grimm decades ago. The air here was stagnant, smelling of wet stone and the lingering bitter ash of dissolved monsters. For Team RWBY, this mission was supposed to be a standard scouting operation, identify the movement of the White Fang, and clear out any encroaching Grimm nests. They moved through the skeletal remains of a shopping center with the practiced grace of a high-tier team. Ruby Rose led the way, her red cloak a defiant splash of color against the monochrome ruins. Crescent Rose held in a ready position. Beside her, Weiss Schnee checked her Myrtenaster's dust chambers, while Blake Belladonna and Yang Xiaolong kept watch on the crumbling upper tiers. "Something feels off," Blake whispered, her cat ears twitching beneath her bow. "The Grimm, they're not hunting us. They're running." "Running from what?" Yang asked, her gauntlets, ember celica, clicking as she tightened her grip. "We're the scariest things in this tunnel." A distant roar echoed through the concrete cavern, not the sound of a Grimm, but the mechanical scream of a high-output engine combined with the percussive boom of an explosion. The floor beneath their feet vibrated with a rhythmic, heavy cadence. It was the sound of something massive moving with terrifying speed. Ruby signaled for them to move up, and the team peered over a jagged ledge into what had once been a central subway hub. The sight below stopped their hearts. A massive swarm of Grimm, dozens of creeps, a handful of boar batusks, and a pair of towering Goliaths were being driven into a corner, but they weren't being herded by a battalion of soldiers or a team of huntsmen. They were being dismantled by a single, green-clad figure. The Doomslayer moved through the pack with a violence so absolute it bordered on the surreal. He was a blur of jade armor and shimmering violet light, the dust-infused energy from his recent acquisition at the mine now bleeding from his suit's vents like a supernatural exhaust. A boar batusk rolled toward him, its tusks spinning like a meat grinder. The Slayer didn't dodge. He stepped into the spin, caught the creature by its armored plates, and slammed it into the ground with such force that the concrete buckled. Before it could recover, he jammed the barrels of his super shotgun into its maw and pulled the trigger. The blast was a localized supernova of fire dust and kinetic force, vaporizing the Grimm's head in a spray of black sparks. "Is that the person Ozpin told us about?" Weiss whispered, her voice trembling. The one from the Emerald Forest? He's not even using a semblance, Ruby noted, her silver eyes wide. She watched as a Goliath, a creature the size of a small building, swung its trunk to crush the intruder. The slayer leaped, his thrusters firing a violent violet flare, and grabbed onto the beast's tusk. He hauled himself up, his movements lacking the weightless acrobatics of a huntsman, replaced instead by the raw, crushing power of a machine. He reached the Goliath's head and, with a guttural growl that Ruby could hear even from the ledge, began to punch. Each blow sounded like a demolition hammer, striking stone. On the third strike, the Goliath's bone mask shattered, and the slayer plunged his doom blade into the creature's brain. As the Goliath began to dissolve into a mountain of black smoke, the slayer dropped to the ground, surrounded by the remaining creeps. Ruby couldn't stay a spectator any longer. "He's going to get surrounded. We have to help," she cried, leaping from the ledge, her cloak billowing like a wingspan. Crescent Rose transformed midair, and she landed with a sniper-round impact, scything through a creep that was lunging at the slayer's back. Weiss, Blake, and Yang followed, a whirlwind of ice, shadows, and fire. They fought with the coordination that had made them legends at Beacon. Weiss froze the ground to trip the swifter Grimm. Blake used her clones to distract the pack, and Yang's punches sent shockwaves through the ranks. But as they fought, they realized they weren't helping the Slayer. They were merely getting in his way. The Slayer didn't acknowledge their presence with a nod or a greeting. To him, they were 4 more variables in a tactical environment. When a creep lunged at Blake, the Slayer didn't wait for her to counter. He fired his heavy cannon, the round whistling inches past her ear to detonate the Grimm. When Yang charged an alpha Beowulf, the Slayer intercepted it first, his chainsaw roaring to life. He carved through the beast with a horrific, wet sound, the black smoke of its death coating Yang's yellow hair. "Hey, watch the hair, pal," Yang shouted, frustrated by his lack of battlefield etiquette. The Slayer ignored her. He was already moving toward the last remaining Goliath. Maybe the creature trumpeted in fear, a sound the girls had never heard from a Grimm before, and tried to retreat. The Slayer raised his left arm. A small launcher on his shoulder clicked, and a grenade of frozen hardlight dust hissed through the air. It struck the Goliath's leg, encasing it in a massive block of violet ice. He didn't finish it with a gun. He walked up to the immobilized Titan, grabbed its remaining tusk, and began to pull. The girls watched in morbid fascination as the metal of his gauntlets groaned. The Slayer's feet sank into the cracked stone as he braced himself. With a horrific, splintering crack, he tore the tusk, 6 feet of solid, bone-like material, clean out of the Goliath's face. He then swung the tusk like a spear, driving it through the creature's eye and out the back of its skull. The silence that followed was heavy. The last of the Grimm had dissolved. The subway hub was empty save for the 5 humans. The Slayer stood in the center of the clearing, his chest heaving slightly, the violet glow of his suit slowly dimming. Ruby stepped forward, her scythe folded back into its compact form. Hello," she said, her voice small in the vast cavern. "I'm Ruby. We're students from Beacon. We saw you fighting and, well, you're really good, but you almost hit my friend." The Slayer slowly turned his head. His visor was a blank, reflective pool of cold green. He looked at Ruby, then at the rest of her team. He saw their aura, the shimmering, colorful light of their souls. To him, it looked fragile. It looked like a flickering candle in a hurricane. He saw their weapons, ornate, complex, and reliant on a resource they treated with reverence. He saw children playing at war in a world that was preparing to devour them. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. The air around him felt heavy with the weight of 1 billion slaughtered demons. He reached down and picked up a discarded dust crystal from the floor, a piece Weiss had dropped during the fight. He crushed it in his palm, letting the energy hiss into his siphoning vents, then turned and began to walk deeper into the tunnels of Mountain Glen, toward the heart of the White Fang's operations. "Wait," RWBY called out. "Where are you going? It's dangerous down there." The Slayer didn't stop. He didn't look back. "RWBY, let him go," Blake said, her voice shaking. She was looking at the ground where the Goliath had died. The stone wasn't just cracked, it was pulverized. "He's not a huntsman, RWBY. He didn't kill those Grimm to save us. He killed them because they were there." "He's a monster," Weiss whispered, clutching her arm. "A monster that kills monsters." RWBY watched the green silhouette disappear into the darkness. She had always believed that being a huntsman was about being a hero, about the light of the soul overcoming the darkness. But looking at the trail of absolute, unblinking destruction the Slayer had left behind, she felt a cold shiver of realization. The Slayer didn't care about light. He didn't care about being a hero. He was a force of nature that had arrived to end a war, and he didn't care if the world survived the process. The underground rail tunnels of Mountain Glen were a labyrinth of shadow and echoing steel, a subterranean artery that had once carried the lifeblood of a budding civilization. Now, it served a darker purpose. The White Fang had converted the central maintenance hub into a staging ground for their ultimate retribution, a train laden with enough fire dust to breach the walls of Vytal, and a literal army of Grimm lured into the wake of its passage. Roman Torchwick, leaning against a shipping crate with his signature cane and a smirk of practiced nonchalance, checked his watch. Beside him, Adam Taurus stood like a statue of vengeful conviction, his red and black aesthetic a sharp contrast to the drab industrial surroundings. Around them, hundreds of Faunus operatives moved with purposeful haste, loading the final cars and checking their weaponry. They were the masters of the dark, the monsters under the bed of every human in the kingdom. The first sign that the nightmare had arrived was not a sound, but a vibration. It started as a low-frequency hum that rattled the crates and caused the dust crystals in their racks to sing. Then came the sound, the rhythmic, hydraulic hiss and heavy thud of metal on a concrete. It was coming from the ventilation shaft, a shaft 300 feet above the tunnel floor. There was no warning. The reinforced steel grate didn't just fall. It was punched downward with the force of a falling star. The Doomslayer followed it, a jade-green comet of kinetic energy. He didn't use a parachute or a semblance to slow his descent. He utilized the sheer mass of his Praetor Suit, hitting the concrete floor in a three-point landing that sent a shockwave through the hub, buckling the floor and tossing several White Fang guards into the air like rag dolls. A heavy, oppressive silence fell over the tunnel. The White Fang operatives, many of whom had fought through countless skirmishes with the Atlas military, froze. They looked at the figure rising from the crater. He was larger than any man they had ever seen, his armor scorched and his visor a cold, unblinking green. He didn't issue a demand. He didn't declare his allegiance. He simply looked at the cages at the far end of the hub, cages filled with captive, snarling creeps and beowulfs intended for the breach. "Intruder!" a White Fang lieutenant screamed, drawing a jagged katana. "Kill him!" The response was a symphony of violence. So the Slayer didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the lieutenant. In a blur of motion, he closed the distance, his hand closing around the Faunus's throat. With a nonchalant flick of his wrist, he hurled the man 20 yards into a stack of volatile fire dust crates. The explosion was a brilliant, searing orange that painted the tunnel in fire. The Slayer walked through the flames, his armor's siphoning vents drinking in the thermal energy, his violet HUD shimmering with newfound power. The White Fang opened fire. Submachine guns, sniper rifles, and dust blades rained a storm of projectiles upon him. The Slayer ignored them. To a man who had stood at the gates of the Dark Lord's citadel, the stinging of small arms fire was beneath notice. He reached for the heavy cannon and engaged the micro-missile rack. The weapon barked. as a rapid-fire cadence of high-explosive payloads that turned the White Fang's defensive line into a graveyard of twisted metal and smoke. Adam Taurus watched the carnage, his hand tightening on the hilt of Wilt and Blush. He had seen the power of the Schnee military and the skill of Beacon's elite, but this was something he couldn't categorize. This man wasn't fighting for a cause. He was erasing an obstacle. "Enough!" Adam roared, his voice cutting through the din of gunfire. He stepped forward, his red cloak swirling like blood. "You dare interfere with the justice of the Faunus? You are nothing but another human oppressor, hidden behind a suit of scrap metal." Adam lunged, his semblance, moon-slice, ready to absorb the kinetic energy of the Slayer's armor and return it in a single, devastating stroke. He was a blur of crimson, his blade whistling toward the Slayer's neck. The Slayer didn't block. He didn't parry. He caught the blade with his bare gauntlet. The sound of metal on metal echoed through the tunnel. Adam's eyes went wide beneath his mask. Moon Slice was supposed to absorb the energy, but there was nothing to absorb. The Slayer's strength was not a byproduct of aura or magical energy. It was the raw, physical output of a being empowered by divinity and machine. The Slayer squeezed. The high-quality Atlesian steel of Adam's sword groaned, then snapped. The Slayer's other hand shot out, a closed fist that caught Adam squarely in the chest. The impact shattered the Faunus leader's aura instantly, the shockwave tossing him backward like a leaf in a gale. Adam hit the side of the train with a sickening thud, coughing up blood as he slumped to the ground. So the Slayer didn't follow up to finish him. His attention was diverted. The commotion and the scent of blood had driven the captive Grimm into a frenzy. They had broken their cages. A swarm of creeps and a massive, bone-plated Ursa Major spilled into the hub, sensing the fear of the White Fang. The terrorists, once the masters of these beasts, found themselves caught between the Green Titan and the monsters they had brought to the city's doorstep. The Slayer welcomed them. He retrieved the chainsaw, the motor roaring to life with a predatory scream that drowned out the panic of the White Fang. He moved into the Grimm with a savage joy that was palpable even through his armor. He was a gardener, weeding a bed of thorns. He sawed through a creep's torso, the black smoke of its death mingling with the exhaust of his suit. But he grabbed a Beowulf by its jaw and tore it in half, using the cooling, dissolving corpse to club another into the ground. The White Fang began to flee. This wasn't a battle. It was an execution. They had spent years styling themselves as the monsters that humans should fear, but in the presence of the Doomslayer, they realized they were merely prey. He was the apex predator, the thing that monsters dreamed of when they had nightmares. He didn't care about their revolution. He didn't care about their oppression. He saw a nest of corruption, and he was the fire that would cleanse it. Roman Torchwick, ever the pragmatist, had already slipped toward the cockpit of the lead locomotive. "Adam, forget the plan. Get on the train now," he yelled, firing his cane cannon to clear a path. Adam, his pride shattered along with his ribs, scrambled onto the moving car. The train began to lurch forward, its wheels screeching against the rusted tracks as it sped toward the tunnel leading to Vale. The Slayer stood in the center of the hub, surrounded by the dissolving remains of 50 Grimm and the charred ruins of the White Fang's base. He watched the taillights of the train disappear into the dark. He didn't chase it. He looked at the massive crates of refined gravity dust the White Fang had left behind in their panic. He walked to the crates, his gauntlets shimmering with violet energy. He began to siphon. He didn't need to catch the train. He knew where it was going. He knew that the darkness was converging on the city above, and that the queen of this world was sending her best to greet him. He adjusted the seal on his helmet, on the internal HUD recalibrating for a high-intensity combat theater. The White Fang had meant to bring a war to Vale. They had no idea that they had simply provided the Doomslayer with a faster way to find the enemy. The subterranean transit tunnels leading from Mountain Glen to the heart of Vale were a cathedral of echoing shadows, but for the Doomslayer, they were a firing range. He did not run. He moved with a relentless, ground-eating stride that was faster than any human sprint, his heavy boots rhythmically striking the rusted maintenance catwalks. The violet glow of siphoned gravity dust bled from the seams of his Praetor Suit, creating a shimmering aura that distorted the air around him. His internal HUD was a flurry of activity, mapping the tunnel layout and tracking the acoustic signatures of the escaping train miles ahead. It also flagged a new bio-signature. It wasn't the blank void of a Grimm, nor the flickering, fragile light of the students he had encountered. This was something different. It was a jagged, frantic pulse, now radiating a level of neurochemical instability that the suit's AI categorized as extreme psychological volatility. A high-pitched, manic giggle echoed through the tunnel, bouncing off the damp concrete walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Oh my, the Queen was right. You're a cold, quiet little thing, aren't you?" The Slayer stopped. He didn't look around with the frantic eyes of a man being hunted. He slowly pivoted on his heel, his shotgun resting on his shoulder, his gaze fixed on a tangle of rusted pipes near the ceiling. A figure dropped from the darkness, landing with the unnatural grace of an insect. Tyrion Callows stood before him, his purple and grey vestments tattered, his metallic scorpion tail twitching with a life of its own. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and dancing with a feverish light, so he didn't look like a warrior. He looked like a fracture in reality. No soul, not a glimmer. It's like staring into a well that never ends. Tyrion hissed, his head tilting at an impossible angle. "My goddess is fascinated by you, stranger. She wonders if you can bleed. She wonders if you can fear." The Slayer's response was a blast from the super shotgun. He didn't wait for the villain to finish his monologue. He was not a participant in a drama. He was an executioner. Tyrion shrieked with delight as he flipped backward, his tail catching the buckshot midair and deflecting the pellets into the walls. He moved like a blur, a whirlwind of blades and stinging strikes. He was faster than the ace operatives, his movements dictated by a chaotic instinct that defied conventional combat logic. He lunged, his dual wrist blades. Queen hiss, whistling toward the Slayer's visor. The Slayer parried the strike with his forearm, the metal of the Praetor Suit sparking against Tyrion's blades. He followed up with a crushing punch, but Tyrion wasn't there. The madman had already transitioned into a low sweep, his tail whipping around to strike at the Slayer's knee. The stinger hit the jade armor with the force of a hammer, the deadly venom of the scorpion faunus coating the metal. "Does it hurt? Does the poison sting?" Tyrion cackled, circling him like a predator. The Slayer looked down at his leg. A hazard-detected warning flashed on his HUD, followed immediately by biocontaminant neutralized. The Praetor Suit's medical systems had already identified the toxin and deployed a counteragent. To the Slayer, so the poison of a man was nothing compared to the necrotic rot of the umbral plains. He looked back at Tyrion, and for the first time, he reached for the ballista. The weapon hummed to life, a twin-pronged railgun that crackled with orange energy. The Slayer fired a concentrated bolt of pure kinetic force. Tyrion dodged, the bolt vaporizing a massive section of the tunnel wall behind him, but the shockwave caught him, shattering his aura in a single brilliant flash of purple light. Tyrion's laughter stopped. He hit the ground hard, his breath hitching. For a man who lived for the thrill of the kill, the sudden absence of his spiritual shield was a cold bucket of water. He scrambled back as the Slayer approached, each heavy footfall sounding like the tolling of a funeral bell. You're not human," Tyrion whispered, so his bravado replaced by a genuine, shivering wonder. "You're a god of death, a silent, green god." The Slayer didn't care about the theology. He raised the ballista for a finishing shot, but the tunnel suddenly shook. Above them, the ceiling began to buckle as the train, laden with fire dust, detonated prematurely in the tunnels closer to the city. The shock wave traveled through the subterranean network like a tidal wave. Dust and debris rained down, and a section of the roof collapsed between the two combatants. Tyrion used the distraction. He leapt into the darkness of a side maintenance shaft, his tail providing the leverage to disappear into the gloom. "We will meet again, my Lord of Ruin," his voice echoed, fading into the distance. "The Queen will want to see you in the flesh." The Slayer didn't pursue, but he had a primary objective. His HUD showed the breach had been successful. Grimm were already pouring into the streets of Vale through the hole the train had made. He turned toward the light at the end of the tunnel, the distant screams of a city under siege reaching his ears. As he emerged into the open air of Vale's industrial district, the scene was one of total, chaotic war. The sky was black with nevermores, and the streets were a churning sea of black fur and bone plates. Buildings were on fire, and the local police and junior huntsmen were being systematically overrun. The Slayer didn't hesitate. He didn't look for a commander to take orders from. He looked for the largest concentration of the enemy. A Deathstalker, a scorpion like Grimm the size of a tank, was currently smashing through a barricade where a group of civilians were huddling. The Slayer jumped from the tunnel entrance, his thrusters firing a violent violet flare that carried him across the street. He landed directly on the Deathstalker's back. The creature screeched, its massive pincers snapping at the air, but the Slayer was an anchor of iron. He grabbed the base of the creature's tail and pulled. The sound of chitinous armor fracturing was like a tree snapping. With a roar of effort, he ripped the entire tail assembly from the Grimm's body. He didn't discard it. He used the stinger as a makeshift spear, plunging it deep into the Deathstalker's head. As the creature dissolved, the civilians looked up at their savior. They didn't see a hero. They saw a terrifying and blood-stained titan that looked more like the monsters he was killing than the protectors they knew. The Slayer didn't wait for their thanks. He checked his ammunition counts. 40%. It was enough. He began his march through the city, a one-man army clearing the streets with a brutal, mechanical efficiency. He was not here to save Vale. He was here to exterminate the infestation. And as the Vytal Festival began its descent into the nightmare of the fall, the Doomslayer was the only thing standing between the world and the absolute dark. He was the void that Salem had sensed, and now that void was hungry. The sky above Vale was no longer a canopy of blue. It was a charcoal-gray shroud of ash and smoke, illuminated by the hellish orange glow of a city in its death throes. Cinderfall's masterpiece was a symphony of perfectly timed tragedies. The Atlasian Knights, once the gleaming protectors of the peace, had been subverted by a digital plague, their visors glowing and angry, viral red as they turned their weapons on the very citizens they were built to guard. The communications were dead, the schools were under siege, and the Grimm, drawn by the sheer, concentrated despair of millions, were flooding the streets in a tide that seemed bottomless. But in the center of the industrial district, the tide had hit a wall. The Doomslayer was no longer a man. He was a walking breach in the fabric of the invasion, and the violet gravity dust he had siphoned from the White Fang was now fully integrated into the Praetor Suit's systems, manifesting as a shimmering, hyper-reactive field that caused the air to crackle with static whenever he moved. His internal HUD was a blood-red map of targets. He didn't see the panicked civilians or the burning architecture. He saw the tactical geometry of a culling. A squad of hacked Atlasian Knights, Model 290s, surrounded him, their arm cannons pivoting to lock onto his silhouette. They were programmed to recognize human anatomy and exploit its weaknesses. They were not programmed for a transdimensional warrior who viewed heavy infantry as target practice. The Slayer didn't use a gun. He moved with a violent, sudden burst of speed, catching the lead knight by its shoulder actuators. With a single, brutal twist, he tore the robot's torso from its legs, using the sparking, electrified wreckage as a heavy bludgeon. He swung the half-ton of Atlesian steel in a wide arc, the sheer kinetic force shattering 3 more knights into heaps of scrap and logic boards. He reached for the plasma rifle. The weapon, now overcharged with refined hard light dust, groaned as it cycled. He pulled the trigger, and instead of the usual rapid-fire bolts, it released a continuous, incandescent beam of violet energy. He swept the beam across the street, vaporizing a pack of Beowulfs and melting the armor of a squadron of rogue droids in a single, searing pass. The heat was so intense, it turned the asphalt to glass. High above, perched on the spire of Beacon Tower, the Wyvern, the ancient, draconic Grimm that Cinder had summoned to ensure the city's fall, let out a roar that shook the foundations of the academy. It was a massive, skeletal nightmare, and from its wings it dripped a viscous black ichor that birthed new Grimm wherever it touched the ground. It was a factory of death, a super-heavy class entity that dominated the battlefield. The Slayer looked up. His HUD highlighted the Wyvern, pulsing with a golden, threat-level, absolute icon. It was the heart of the infestation. It was the source. He began his march toward Beacon, a straight line of destruction through the war-torn city. He wasn't running to save the school. He was moving to dismantle the hub. He encountered Team RWBY and the remnants of Team JNPR near the central plaza. They were battered, their aura levels dangerously low. They fighting a desperate holding action against a pair of Goliaths and a swarm of Griffins. Ruby Rose was on her knees, her scythe used as a crutch, her eyes fixed on the massive dragon atop the tower. She looked at the Slayer as he approached, his armor dripping with black Grimm mist and robot hydraulic fluid. "It's too much," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can't stop it. The Grimm, they just keep coming." The Slayer didn't stop to offer a hand. He didn't give a speech about the light of the soul. He reached into the magnetic housing on his thigh and retrieved a handle of cold, dark metal. He thumbed the activation switch. With a sound like a choir of the damned screaming in unison, the crucible ignited. A blade of pure, unadulterated argent energy, now flickering with the violet instability of the dust siphoned from this world, erupted into existence. It was a jagged, searing line of crimson and purple that seemed to cut the very air. The students watched in stunned, terrified silence. They had seen maidens use magic and huntsmen use dust, but this was something else. This was the embodiment of a world-ending will. The Slayer didn't speak, but for the first time his HUD broadcast an external audio frequency. A low, distorted rumble that vibrated in the student's very bones. Unyielding, he lunged. His thrusters fired with such violence they shattered the concrete beneath him, propelling him through the air like a cannonball. He slammed into the first Goliath, the crucible blade passing through its armored skull as if it were made of smoke. He didn't slow down. He used the dissolving corpse of the giant Grimm as a platform, leaping again toward the griffins circling above. He caught one by its beak, swung himself over its back, and decapitated it mid-flight before using its momentum to propel himself toward the base of Beacon Tower. He scaled the tower, not with the grace of an acrobat, but with the ferocity of a siege engine. He punched his gauntlets into the masonry, tearing out chunks of stone as he hauled his massive frame upward. The hacked Atlesian knights on the balconies fired at him, but he simply swatted them into the abyss, his focus fixed solely on the Wyvern at the summit. He reached the top just as Cinderfall was approaching the wounded Pyrrha Nikos. The Fall Maiden, her eyes glowing with stolen power, turned to face the intruder, on her lips curling into a smirk of supreme confidence. "Another hero for the pyre?" she mocked, raising a hand to summon a storm of glass shards. The Slayer ignored her. He ignored the girl on the ground. He ignored the political machinations and the stolen magic. He looked at the wyvern, the massive dragon that was currently leaning over the edge of the tower to spawn more horrors. He reached for the weapon on his back that he had held in reserve, the BFG 9000. The weapon's core, now fed by a concentrated slurry of siphoned gravity and fire dust, began to hum with a sound that caused the very stone of the tower to groan. The green glow of the BFG was now a violent, oscillating white and violet. Cinder's eyes went wide. For all her power, for all her planning, she had never seen a weapon that radiated such absolute, cold-blooded annihilation. The Slayer pulled the trigger. The projectile was not a bolt, but a sun. A massive sphere of incandescent violet-white plasma traveled across the roof of the tower, its tendrils of energy reaching out to lash at anything with a soul or a spark of malice. Cinder screamed as her aura was stripped away by the sheer proximity of the shot. The projectile struck the wyvern squarely in its chest. There was no explosion. There was only a soundless, blinding flash of pure negation. The wyvern didn't die. It was erased. Its physical form, its connection to the pools of darkness, its very existence was overwritten by the BFG's discharge. The shockwave of the hit traveled down the tower, from the kinetic force so great that it cleared the sky of Nevermores for miles and caused the remaining Grimm in the city to dissolve into dust as their psychic anchor was vaporized. The Slayer stood in the center of the tower's roof, the BFG cooling in his hands, the violet static of his suit slowly subsiding. He didn't look at the defeated Cinder or the rescued student. He looked out over the city. The invasion had been broken. The unstoppable tide had been met with a more perfect destruction. He was the Doomslayer, and he had come to Remnant to remind the darkness that even it could be slaughtered. The silence that followed the discharge of the BFG 9000 was more deafening than the roar of the wyvern had ever been. It was a vacuum of sound, a momentary suspension of the laws of physics that left the air at the top of Beacon Tower smelling of ozone, scorched stone, and the metallic tang of ionized dust. The massive, skeletal dragon that had been the anchor of Cinderfall's victory was simply gone. No black smoke remained. No dissolving particles drifted on the wind. It had been overwritten by a superior force of negation. The shockwave had cleared the clouds of ash for miles, allowing the cold, indifferent light of the shattered moon to spill onto the carnage below. For a single, fleeting moment, the war for Remnant had stopped as every living thing, and every soulless monster, turned their gaze toward the spire. Cinderfall lay amidst the rubble of the roof, her clothes singed and her aura shattered into a million useless shards. The stolen fire of the Fall Maiden flickered weakly in her eyes, a dying ember in the face of the solar flare she had just witnessed. She looked up at the Doomslayer, her mouth agape in an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Her plans, her manipulations, her destiny, all of it had been rendered irrelevant by a being who didn't even know her name. He hadn't fought her magic. He had simply deleted the stage she stood upon. When the Slayer turned his visor toward her, Cinder didn't see a hero coming to arrest her. She saw the end. Panic, a sensation she had forgotten, surged through her, and she used the last of her strength to conjure a desperate cloud of smoke and glass. She throwing herself over the edge of the tower to vanish into the chaos of the city below. She was a survivor, and she knew that to stay in that green giant's presence was to invite non-existence. The Slayer didn't pursue. He didn't even acknowledge her flight. He looked down at Pyrrha Nikos, who was staring at him with a mixture of terror and profound gratitude. He saw the shimmering golden light of her soul, battered but unbroken. He reached down, his heavy, blood-stained gauntlet looking like a crushing vice, but his touch was surprisingly steady. He didn't offer words of comfort. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder for a fraction of a second, a soldier's acknowledgement of a comrade in arms. before turning his gaze toward the horizon. General Ironwood's flagship, the Mantle's Pride, hovered in the distance, and its hull scarred and its engines sputtering. On the bridge, Ironwood stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the tactical display that showed the Wyvern's biosignature had flatlined. He had spent his life building a military to protect the world, believing that order and technology were the only shields against the dark. But he realized now that he had been playing with toys. The Green Knight hadn't saved Beacon through strategy or leadership. He had saved it through the sheer, unyielding application of absolute force. The general felt a cold, sinking realization. The world he knew was gone. The balance of power had not just shifted. The scale had been crushed. In the land of darkness, Salem stood on her balcony. Her crimson eyes narrowed until they were mere slits of hate. The Wyvern was her masterpiece, a creature of ancient, concentrated malice that should have been invincible. To see it erased by a single shot of alien technology was an insult to her very divinity. She could feel the Slayer, even now, a cold, silent void in the heart of her world. He was not a savior. He was an invasive species. He was the fire that cleanses the forest, and she was the rot that the fire was meant to consume. "Let him come," she whispered to the empty twilight air, her voice a promise of eternal suffering. "Let the Slayer find the heart of the darkness. I will see if his rage can survive the silence of an immortal grave." Below the tower, Team RWBY gathered in the courtyard. They watched as the Slayer descended, not by stairs, but by leaping from the balconies, his thrusters firing in short, violent bursts. He landed among them, so the violet static of his suit fading as the siphoned dust reserves finally depleted. Ruby Rose stepped forward, her red cloak tattered, her silver eyes shimmering with unshed tears. She wanted to say so many things. To thank him, to ask him who he was, to ask if he would stay and help them find the others. The Slayer stopped in front of her. He was a mountain of jade and iron, a relic of 1,000 wars that made their struggle look like a playground dispute. He reached for his belt and retrieved a small, discarded object he had picked up in the ruins of the tower, a small silver rose emblem that had fallen from Ruby's cloak during the chaos. He pressed it into her hand, his visor reflecting her small, fragile face. He didn't speak, but the message was clear. Keep fighting. He didn't wait for a response. He walked past them, and his heavy boots crunching on the fragments of destroyed Atlesian knights and dissolving Grimm. He headed toward the north, toward the mountains where the most powerful of the Grimm were said to dwell. The battle for Beacon was over, but for the Doomslayer, the war had only just begun. He had found a world of monsters, and he was the only thing they truly feared. He didn't care about the relics, or the maidens, or the fate of kingdoms. He was a weapon of absolute certainty, and until every shadow on Remnant was scorched by his fire, he would not stop. He vanished into the smoke-filled woods of the Emerald Forest, a legend in the making, leaving behind a world that would never, ever be the same. Conclusion. The arrival of the Doomslayer fundamentally shattered the trajectory of Remnant's history. The fall of Beacon, intended by Salem to be the death knell of human hope, instead became the birth of a terrifying new era. While the city was scarred and the academy wounded, the unbeatable Grimm were proven to be nothing more than prey for a sufficiently determined predator. The Slayer's presence acted as a chaotic variable that Ozpin's wisdom could not predict and Salem's malice could not account for. The maidens and the silver-eyed warriors were no longer the only lights in the dark. They were now accompanied by a shadow of green armor and relentless fury that moved with a purpose beyond their understanding. As the Slayer marches toward the land of darkness, the factions of Remnant are forced to adapt. Ironwood's Atlas becomes more militarized, driven by a desperate need to match the Slayer's power. Team RWBY finds a new, a harder edge to their conviction, learning that while hope is a shield, rage can be a sword. And in the heart of the Grimm lands, Salem prepares for a conflict she never anticipated, a war not of souls and secrets, but of iron and blood. The legend of the Green Knight has only just begun, and the Grimm will soon learn that while they may be the masters of fear, the Slayer is the master of the end. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below.